Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're broadcasting from tonight. We pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. Welcome to our first UQ Talks for the year. I'm Tegan Taylor. I'm a presenter with ABC Radio National, and I'm your host and moderator for this series. AI is quickly transforming workplaces and classrooms all around the world. It's forcing us all to reimagine the way we work, think, and create. So tonight we're going to give you a deeper understanding of the advantages and risks of using AI in our everyday lives and what this means for the future. Before we enter the world of AI, a reminder that you, a human, can be part of this discussion by asking questions by using the Q&A button on your screen. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. We've had lots of excellent questions, which has really helped curate the topics for tonight's discussion. Before we jump in, I'd like to introduce our panel. Joining me in the studio are Professor Tim Miller, a Professor of Artificial Intelligence in UQ's School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. Professor Miller's research mission is to improve the capabilities of expert decision makers by using AI to do the hard things. Associate Professor Ida Sommer is an Associate Professor in Business Analytics and Information Systems at the University School of Business. Associate Professor Sommer is a qualitative researcher navigating the new opportunities and challenges that AI opens up for organisations. And Associate Professor Hassan Khosravi is an Associate Professor in Data Science and Learning Analytics at the Institute for Teaching and Learning Innovation. Associate Professor Khosravi is passionate about the role artificial intelligence has on the future of education and finding technical solutions that enhance student learning and experience. Safe to say I have the right people joining me tonight. Let's get into it. Tim, I'll start with you with a bit of scene setting. Where does AI, where we are today, compared to with what people would have been predicting in a chat like this 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think the big change has been large language models, which everyone's probably familiar with ChatGPT. So if we go back 5 years, we had language models. I built my first language model when probably about 2016 or 17 when I was learning how to use a particular technology.
Who doesn't remember the first time they built a language model?
Yeah, exactly. And this one was it was based from a textbook exercise, build a language model. I think it was based on Hemingway texts to write like Hemingway. And it was terrible, right? It didn't write very good, but it sounded a bit like Hemingway. And I think probably I think it was 2017, Google published a paper that said, well, we can take those techniques and scale them up. And these things learn a lot quicker. And then these large tech labs thought, why don't we just basically chuck the entire internet at these things and see if they can learn everything, right? Everything that's on the internet. And that's how we ended up with large language models. They have a huge repository of knowledge. And all of a sudden now we have what I would say is probably a general purpose tool where we can ask questions. When I first played with GPT-2, it wasn't that this thing was there, it was that, holy hell, it can talk about anything. This can talk about anything. And now we've got something that can talk about anything. Not very well, it's not very good at anything. It's good at writing and summarizing, but I think that's the big difference. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago, will somebody build this large model trained on the internet? I would have said, well, you could, but why would you? That seems like a huge waste of money, but it turned out to work reasonably well. So I think that's the big thing, that's the big change we've seen. And now, everybody, this session's on, everybody has AI in their tongue and they're using it.
Ida, what goes into building the sorts of tools that we are now interacting with in our day-to-day lives?
So I guess the biggest thing is Tim mentioned would be just data, and this is, I guess, with GPTs, this has become everything from all of the data from the text from the books, all of the chats online, all of the websites, news items, social platforms and everything. So I think data is the really, really big part of this. And of course, we had algorithms, from 1950s and so on. Neural networks were available for a long time, but we didn't have the compute power and we didn't have the data to actually scale and build the systems, the GPTs or the systems that we have right now. And I think what has happened in just recently is that the compute has become lot faster, and we have so much data and we are able to feed them into these neural networks and to these algorithms that basically are able, from a GPT perspective, they're able
When
predict.
you say GPT, you mean?
I mean the general sort of transformers. So this is the OpenAI models, Google's Gemini, and all of that. And there's another GPT, which is basically is general purpose technology. And I do see AI as a general purpose technology. And one would look at three kind of characteristics to understand what a general purpose technology is. One is that they have to be pervasive. And by now, we all know that AI tools now are not within the boundaries of organizations. They're consumerized, all consumers have access to them and so on, and that they evolve. And of course, these tools, one of the things about the AI systems and what goes into them is that they learn, they're constantly learning. And so that's, again, another characteristics of this sort of general purpose technology. And the last one is that they will spawn or they will enable complementary innovation. For example, when we had electricity, we could go around the world and change everything and the way we lived because we now have electricity. And when it comes to AI as a general purpose technology, one of the Stanford professors says, you know, that the general purpose technology is about intelligence, and intelligence is the most generic or general thing that we can create. And if we add that intelligence to anything, the way we live, the way we work, the way we do things, it's that complementary innovation piece that we can basically change everything with it.
Which feels really exciting and really daunting and maybe scary, which is why we're having this conversation. Hassan, I think a couple of, even just 2 years ago, it felt very theoretical. We're now relying on AI more and more in our daily lives. Is that a problem?
It's a really good question. There has been other technologies that we rely on. We rely on our cars, we rely on electricity, we rely on internet. Some of those are not necessarily seen in a bad way. We have technologies that have come in ways that they have complemented and augmented us. Think of GPS. They made navigation and traveling a lot easier. But at the same time, they've reduced our cognitive ability for spatial finding our ways. They've come as a way that we rely on them, that if I'm now traveling and I don't have my charger on and my battery goes out, I'm essentially just stuck there. But so they come in ways that they augment you to do more in some aspects, and they take away from some of your ability. I don't necessarily think it's a problem as long as we understand what we're gaining in the process and what we're losing, and make sure that if it is something critical that we're losing, we keep that and we don't over-rely on it in a non-realistic way.
So, like I said before this event, we had so many questions come through from people who are hopefully viewing right now about specific industries and how AI will disrupt or is already disrupting them. We're not going to get into all of them because we can't, but some of them really align with your own expertise. Ida, just in general, you work a lot with different organisations. How are businesses using AI? Can you give some examples of what you see as being the better end of practice?
Yeah, so I have been studying for a long time, I would say from 2018-19, just specific machine learning algorithms that, AI also comes in the form of machine learning or these sort of language models. And so I've been researching the various use cases. For example, one of the cases I've studied is the cochlear implants, for example. They are AI enabled in that they can adjust the hearing experience as the patient or person who's using these implants as they move around. For example, if they go into a room or a building that has music on, AI is able to sort of detect that there is sort of this sound, and I'm going to now adjust the hearing experience to optimize it for the person. So I guess from a use case perspective, early examples used to be a lot about marketing and manufacturing and so on, but what we see right now is that it's really, really expanding to many industries, including healthcare. I think there's a lot of opportunities in there. Autonomous cars. I was reading the other day that, for example, Waymo in the US right now, the autonomous taxis are taking 150,000 rides a week. So autonomous car transportation in general, it's basically starting to get really, really impacted. Communication, I would say, which is also, in all of these, there is the positive opportunity side, but also the risk side. Communication, just because LLMs have enabled so much of the chatbots to be out there, and everybody, many organizations are just training their own chatbots and agents and so on. The other industry that I would name, so I would mention, transport, healthcare. The other one actually is the IT industry itself. Because one of the things that language models are really good at is writing code and generating code. And of course, I think IT industry itself always has been about efficiencies and creating efficiencies. And now it applies to itself in a way to use the technology to become really efficient, especially as the systems are expanding and scaling. Maybe the last one I would say, I'm not the most informed person on it, but the creative industry, of course, because of the LLMs. Artists, writers.
Which is fraught.
Yeah.
But we might get to that in a little while.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about education specifically. We've got a couple of questions about secondary and primary education. Hassan, I think there's a lot of anxiety around plagiarism or around students not developing critical thinking skills because they can just outsource their brains to the chatbot. How do you see, what sort of opportunities do you see in education with AI?
I think education is one of the industries that is really struggling to see how they can adapt with large language models. It's essentially letting us rethink what we need to do as assessment items in terms of activities that we do for students, because 95% of the things that we used to ask students to do, you can now essentially do with a click of a button. That is sort of on the challenge side, that might rob students of the ability to actually critically think about a lot of these things. It will take away the ability from the instructors to actually assess students, what they're doing, and sort of assess their competencies in a meaningful way. But at the same time, we now have 24/7 bots that can respond to any questions you've got. For the first time, you have this personal tutor at your hand, 24/7, almost free. Which really allows us to rethink about how we do learning. There's been various learning theories that have happened over the many centuries in terms of what are the best ways for students to learn. They've always been based on what's available tutoring guidance we've got, peers, instructors. But now you essentially have this 24/7 role model that you can ask questions, and it's pretty good at explaining many things to you. So if we think about it right, there's many opportunities for students to use these well in terms of how they learn as a tutor, but we also need to make sure that we're not getting our students to really not have their own foundational knowledge and sort of miss on that and rob themselves of that education.
And Tim, once we graduate out of being students and become adults, one of the big things that you're looking at is decision making, big decisions. How is AI, what promise does it have there?
Yeah, I can't really give you a clear answer on that. What studies show is that it's not rosy. That AI helps sometimes a little bit. It makes decisions worse sometimes. Worse, it makes people think they're making better decisions when they're not, and that it's really hard. And so a part of what we work on here is, what are the parts of the decision loop that we really need to put ourselves into in order to help people make those decisions. And what we sort of know is that the way of somebody, say, using a chatbot and saying, hey, give me the answer to this, that doesn't work very well. You need to engage them critically in the decision-making process. And so I'd say that there are some better instances coming out now of expertise being used to improve people's decisions a bit, but it hasn't been transformational in the decision space like you would expect it should be right now. I think the one place where the sort of general purpose things might be helping is if people have a bit of an idea of what they're talking about, but they're not experts, maybe it can help them claw up that expertise ladder a little bit, but I'm skeptical that that's really the case. I suspect they're probably more using it as a crutch.
What about big decisions? Governments making decisions, organisations going like, do we mine here or there? How do we best protect the reef? Like, where is AI most useful in those sorts of big decisions?
Yeah, so the kind of stuff you're talking about now, language models, they're not useful there, right? So that's a lot about basic statistical models, doing simulations, all these types of things here. So we can definitely do things like simulate futures, right? So, okay, if this is, we have these factors here and we want to see what happens if we put this policy in place and we want to do that. We want to see if we put this policy in place and do that. I mean, how do governments use that? I don't work that much with governments. Some of my colleagues who did say, well, the experience is a little bit that they take your model and then change all the parameters until they get the answer they want, which is not a great thing. And so I think, but you can make decisions like that on policy. Again, the jury's out whether that's really a helpful thing. But I think in that case, I think those sort of basic statistical models, what they allow people to do is say, well, we can maybe hold 3 or 4 factors in our head at any time. Machine learning model can hold as many as you feel like, 10,000, and put these things together and give you an idea of what's going on. That seems to be helpful to sort of guide people's thinking.
Can I add on that? It's a really interesting sort of angle, and I fully agree with it. Now, studying GE, I went and looked into their compliance. And of course, GE, huge company, and their compliance, the global compliance sort of operations around the world, they will have 80,000 contractors coming and doing work around the globe for GE. And they needed to make sure that all of these contractors coming in, they would have certain safety standards. They would meet these safety standards so that they actually would let them. And the work, of course, was huge because 80,000 contractors and people sitting and reading these documents, pages after pages. Yes, it meets this criteria and this criteria and this criteria. And the manager at some point said, what about if I can teach a machine to do this? And they worked with their IT and they started teaching the machine all of these, bag of words, what are the collection of the words that will mean a certain thing, or what does it mean? What words mean, a safety standard is met or not. And then they had this pilot and brought it back to the manager, and manager was very skeptical, also being a safety person, was like, I don't trust things easily and I want really, really high accuracy in this thing. And the first thing was that they did this sort of, the blind test. Manager sort of goes through an assessment and then the machine goes through the assessment. And what is interesting is that the manager has made mistakes. So I guess the humans also make mistakes. And then they went around and they had these side-by-side comparisons. They brought in 3,000, auditors that would sit and just compare, human decision versus machine decision. And as they did this, they understood more humans are making mistakes. Just because of the nature of work, it's actually quite tedious, and you get tired and you start making mistakes and so on. And as machines were making all of these mistakes, they basically took that and fed it into the algorithm, so the algorithm became better and better and better. So I think the other side of, I totally agree with Tim, but the other side of it is that the human decision making is also not perfect. And in the way I look at this within organizations is that how do you actually design your work system to make sure that you have consistency, that you can do certain things with a certain standard. So if a human is tired or they're new, or they will not do the work optimally. And then also that, yes, the machines also are not perfect. We all know that. And so how do you manage that?
Can I also add to that? I think we're probably talking about 2 different types of forms of AI. AI is not new to us. For the last 2 decades, for the first 2 decades of the 21st century, we've had a lot of use of narrow AIs, and we use them for decision making. Going back to the GPS, you use it for decision making in terms of the route you take. For license plate reading, they're used in traffics. It's forecasting weather. We get a week of advance notice if a cyclone is coming, not always accurate. But it's not new. So various forms of AI have always been, we use them for decision making. I think what we're talking about and sort of a lot of the new excitement is about a new type of AI, which is beyond these of AI models that have been around for such a long time that do a specific task, but now they're general purpose. They're designed to do everything. And these are the new types of models where, Tim argues that they're not really good at anything. I would argue a little and say they're amazing at a lot of things depending on how you use them. There's various early evidence to suggest that a lot of the current work, 40% of the current work hours, could be automated or impacted by LLMs by early as 2030. Large surveys look at people, around 30% indicated they use it on a daily basis, and they report that their productivity is 3x times. So I think we're talking about various types of AI. We've always been using AI on many aspects for big decisions, even within industry and government for such a long time. But now sort of with large language models and generative AI, it is a new beast. And I guess we're all trying to figure out what that would do.
And also, I mean, I thought you were going to say, we're talking about like automation of decision making versus helping a person make a decision.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, when I said the studies show that these tools don't help people make better decisions, there are plenty of cases where there are AI models that make much better decisions than the person that they're replacing. But you're not going to replace that person. You're not replacing bedside physicians with a tool that does make better diagnoses than them. You're trying to improve their decision making, and that seems to be hard. And studies show that you can have these diagnosis tools that are quite accurate. If you give them to a physician, the decisions get worse. And it's the assumption you could make is, let's get rid of the physician. But if you give it to the patient, it's even worse again, right? You need the physician there. So it's a very difficult landscape right now. But things like automating low stakes decisions, they work well.
So what I'm hearing is that there's so much promise here. There are real upsides, and it's a very global industry. We know that, and we think of ourselves as being sort of one planet, but of course we're not. From an Australian perspective, what does Australia need to own to be able to be successful in this AI future, Ida?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of the big things that we are really missing here perhaps is just investments. And I would say that out of all of those, large language models that have developed around the world, the US owns the biggest number. I think it's more than probably around 45 different models they own. Google owning the most number of them and the various sort of versions of them. And then you have China, which I think they have around 15 large language models developed, and DeepSeek that performs really, really well. And then you have countries like France and some of the European companies, and Australia has none.
Why is that a problem?
I think there are really, really big problems here in terms of, I would say first one for me, it would be the dependency. Because we know that many Australians are already using these models. And these are American, Chinese corporations and so on. And of course, data is the lifeblood of these systems. So first of all, there's the issues of data, privacy, and security of these systems, but also our dependency as a nation to these corporations. And there are multiple futures that can happen because of systems, some future that is very, very dark and a doomsday scenario, and some future that is very, very, very positive. But I believe in a future that we can build. And I think Australia is not actively building that future, and it's going to be more of a dependent nation on where the world, other countries are going. And I see that as a disappointment, and I hope that we can change that.
Tim, when we don't own it, how hard does it make it for us to regulate it or regulate the development of these tools?
It's a good question. Look, you've seen what impact GDPR has on us as Australian consumers because they regulated European citizens. So when you go to a website, GDPR is the European General Data Protection Rights Act. So when you go to a website now and it keeps buzzing you about cookies, and you have to accept the cookies, that's because of GDPR. And that's because European citizens use these tools, use these websites. So, you can regulate far and wide. I don't think Australia would do that. We're not powerful enough like Europe. But I think it's this is not new to AI. This is an old case now. We've got web systems, we've had search engines, all those things. They're all things that we import, we use remotely. And this isn't a new thing, this kind of idea of how do we regulate technology and how do we do it. I mean, to be honest, there's this kind of idea do we have sovereign large language models for ourselves? I think maybe that's probably a pretty good idea to have the capability to build them. I do wonder why we didn't say the same thing about search engines, which I think are probably even more important than large language models. But I think if you have your own, you can kind of start embedding your own values in it and things like this. And that's where you get the benefit of we're able to build these things if we need them. We're able to build them the way that we want to build them, and we don't have to use them. And also, we get to keep the profits that we make from them rather than exporting them to other countries.
Hassan, are we investing enough?
I'm less worried from what Ida is suggesting, in terms of the dependency. Many of these large language models are open source. They're developed out of science. They are accessible if you want to use them. I am also disappointed in terms of Australia and our investments, in terms of better understanding what this means for our future, better understanding how this is going to impact the future of our work. If you look at the large organizations or a sort of ARC is supporting a lot of the research what we do. And if you look at essentially what's been happening in the past few years, there's very little that's been invested in AI centers, whereas you see a lot more investment coming out of Europe and US in these. So less on the dependency side, more that we really understand. We need to understand how these are going to impact our future.
Well, thank you for joining us. I hope you're enjoying the discussion so far. If you want to add your question, you can do that by hitting the Q&A button. I'm going to get to as many questions as I can in a little while when we get into our Q&A section. But of the questions that were submitted beforehand, a lot of people were asking about AI, whether the AI really stands for much. How intelligent is it? How does AI know when something's real or not? Tim, a big criticism is that AI is only as good as the data sets it's trained on. Are we giving it the data it needs to make good decisions?
Well, it really depends on what application you're talking about. So it is true that the quality of the data is really what leads to sort of the outcomes that you get. When you talk about how does AI know what's true or not. So we're focusing here mostly on what's called machine learning, which is this data-driven idea. It doesn't. There is no model of. There is no thought process involved that says, oh, is this true? I'm going to weigh up the options or anything like this. It's just literally saying, I've seen examples like that before, therefore I'm going to spit out the answer that I would have gotten on that same answer. So if you take all the answers you've gotten a quiz and flip the multiple choice questions around, it'll just learn the wrong answers. There's nothing to it about it here. So this is somewhat problematic for these general purpose technologies that we're seeing now. They really are just saying, well, we'll just spit out whatever we've seen on the internet, and then even worse, probably if it hasn't really seen anything like that before, it still gives you an answer very confidently that's ridiculous, and that's where some of the really big risks come out, is that ability to say, yeah, here's some ridiculous answer. Someone with no expertise is not able to judge that, and they go and take some action based on it. So I think, yeah, if you've got really good quality data, you can do something. That's really hard to do with these large sort of general purpose things, because we're basically just scraping most of the internet in, and that's not great quality data.
Malonga was asking this specific question, which I might put to you, Hassan. Given that AI recycles data available on the internet, is it possible for AI to add to the misinformation online?
Indeed. And you might get into these feedback loops, as essentially you get more data which is generated on the internet, which is AI generated. It'll start sort of reinforcing itself in terms of the ability of what it's learning. Having said that, large language models, if we go back to the first generation of large language models, the hallucination, and there's various benchmarks you can look at, the hallucination rate were there close to 20%. So there was a lot of it that they were getting wrong. And if you look at the more advanced recent models, it's close to 1%. There has been a lot of new additions to these models that do make them better. We now have a bit of a reasoning that goes into them. There is chain of thought that gets them to sort of explain what they're doing and the steps they've taken. They're now more increasingly delegating some of the tasks to other tools. So for example, if you used to ask it, what's 3 + 4, it would have seen enough 3 + 4s on the internet to probabilistically think it's a 7. Now it's actually just going to use a calculator. It's going to delegate that task to a tool to do it for it with sort of agentic ways of looking at that. It's a big question, an open-ended question, and even the experts of AI don't agree on this. Are we ever going to get to a model which is going to be always correct? We don't know, but they are getting better. I think there is agreement that we are going to get better to at some point, but are we ever going to be perfect? We're not quite sure.
And one of the things that feeds into that is risks of biases. Ida, how do we develop AI tools that are going to perform in ways that we would consider to be ethical?
Yeah, I guess the question of ethics is a really big question. And I think here a lot of the value system of the organization comes into the play. I think at least that's one of the factors. I would say that companies that are really caring of their consumers and they want to really serve well, they would invest in systems, technologies that will help enable them to be accurate. That's first of all, because sometimes I think this is the part that some organizations might get wrong, which is thinking that for AI to be good and to do good for us, it needs to be accurate. It needs to be good. We need to, and as an organization, we need to develop the capability for it. So the players that just will come in and they will just, some data, they will do some patchy work around it. It's just not going to work. It's not that off-the-shelf tool that you would just and start, playing around with it. You really need to develop that capability. And even if you think about that sort of trustworthiness, one of the big parts of things that I would trust you if you're good at it. So I think that's the part that I actually care a lot. When I go out to organizations, I really look at the practices that they're implementing to make the AI systems transparent. Of course, we're not going to make the neural network transparent. It's impossible. No one can do that. But we can implement practices that would help us remediate some of those biases. For example, in the GE case, they did so much comparison and auditing of AI behavior. They could exactly predict how the model was predicting. So I think there are a lot of sort of organizational way of doing things to make sure the system, first of all, is accurate, and then thinking of this idea of perspective taking, I think, is really, really important, which perhaps at the moment is missing a bit. And that is, for years we have thought of IT as bringing money and revenue and so on. And we really need to expand that to think about what is the value for stakeholders, who's going to be affected by this tool, how, and really do that homework. Some of the good organizations I've seen, they will bring, customers on board. They will have committees in which they're, prioritizing or assessing AI use cases, and they will bring their consumers or customers, target users on board and get their perspectives on. It's still, if you ask me the philosophical, trolley problem question, it's really hard, and I would say that we don't have an answer for it. But if you ask me a question, my answer would be, when we think of cars that, autonomous cars that are moving in a road and there's 2 people here and 3 people, who are we going to hit? I would say that we need to go back and rethink the infrastructure, the road infrastructure, because I think the AI performs well with certain artifacts, with certain, if you design your form in a way that is good for humans, then AI is going to struggle because you design that artifact, that thing for the human. But you can actually, that's where I think there's going to be a lot of reimagining, as you started your, the session with. We're going to need to go and do a lot of reimagining of, okay, if we're delegating this thing to AI, how do we actually design it that the system around it, which is missing right now. I think technology now has really, really progressed, but all of the complementary sort of systems and processes that we need to be able to integrate them in and use them, they're just not there. And that will take time. I think that will take time, but also will need a lot of reimagining of work. And I would hope that everybody will participate in that and will think about those, ethical challenges and how do we actually bring the consumer user perspective into this so that they're also benefiting from this technology.
Such an interesting reframing of that question. I do want to get into some of the anxieties around AI. I think one of the big ones that we hear is that the robots are coming to take our jobs. And we did hear Hassan say before that 40% of work hours could be saved if we did things right. We're all overworked. But then also the idea of having 40% of your work taken away from you leaves you with a bit of like, what am I meant to do then? Hassan, what am I meant to do then?
Find new work. I mean, if you think about it, we used to communicate with mail, right? And you used to send one mail, it would take a month to get there, and you would wait until you respond back. And now we use emails, and instead of sending one mail per month, we send many a day. So it literally shifts and sort of it augments what we do. It takes away some of the things we do and it gives you more things to do. I think right now the various AI tools, and there's new ones literally every day. It's a full-time job just to be on top of the current environment of AI and its latest capabilities. But a lot of it would currently mean that you need to be an absolute expert on various tools to use them. And those that are doing that are moving ahead. They're productive, they're doing a lot. I do hope in near future it will become more accessible in a way that a broader part of the community can have access from a fairness perspective, so that they can all use it in a meaningful way, so that it helps us sort of more broadly as a community rather than individuals.
Tim, what do you reckon?
I'm much more skeptical. You use the example of email. That's the worst productivity tool we've ever invented.
Yeah,
right.
agreed.
That sucks like 2 hours of my day. Like I would much rather go back to sending mails, because what we see is when the price of doing something goes down, people do it more. That's why we get 2 hours of email a day, and I would have sent a letter once a month previously. And I think I would love to be a bit more optimistic, and I hope that this is what happens. But what we're seeing is the attitude is, let's automate the easy, dull tasks. And then we can save time for the really important tasks. Okay, as human beings, we have about 3 hours of really good thinking a day. And we use those other
On a
dull
good day.
tasks. Yeah, that's right. We use that rest of that time to rest our brain and do dull, dirty tasks. So we'll do some, if we're lucky, we do some serious thinking or work. Then we check email for a while, then we go to a meeting, then we do this. It'd be great to say that we could automate that stuff and then work 25 hours a week. I don't think it's going to happen. It would be great to say we're going to automate that and then think a lot more. I don't think it's going to happen. What I would love to see is people automating the valuable tasks a bit more, because they're the ones that actually bring value, right? And it's like, if they're the things that bring value, let's do more of that stuff and less of this stuff. I think if you give people tools to write emails more quickly, they will send longer emails. And then we'll invent tools we have tools that summarize emails for us. And I think that's not the future I want to live in. I want to live in the future that allows me to say, well, this is the part I really enjoy. I'd like to do twice as much of that in the same amount of time.
But then what am I doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I would love to say that we go and work 25 hours a week, but I suspect what's going to happen is, oh wait, we can do that quicker now. I want to see more of that from you, thanks, Tegan. That's what's going to happen. I have no worries at all that we're still going to be working 40 hours a week in 10 years. I just don't think this is a really big issue. I think there will be certain roles that will be disrupted. There's no doubt about it. There will be less of certain types of roles and more of others, but I don't think that most people who are operating in a knowledge environment now will be out of work or working 20 hours in 10 weeks. I wish they were, but I don't see it.
Can I challenge a bit of that, Tim?
Go for it.
So, for the last few years, well more, you like me, probably had the opportunity to collaborate internationally with other people, attend conferences virtually without needing to travel for a week. All at the expense of this technology that now allows you to have this productivity, this better. Sure, you can use it, unproductive if you want, but if you had to mail people, do you think you would have had the ability to collaborate internationally?
Maybe, but that's the internet, and I don't think the internet is the tool that's killed productivity. I think it's specifically email.
Oh, specifically.
Yeah, the internet's been, and search engines have been fantastic, right? They've clearly been.
But quick communications with collaborators, there's got to be some communication.
I would probably
pathway.
call them. Yeah, I would probably just call them.
Tim will do anything before he sends an email.
Yeah, I mean, when I was at my previous university, email server went down one morning. It was the best morning of my career, right?
Ida, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to add, so just going back to your question, I think what you will be doing is that you probably will have 100 or so avatars that are sitting and doing your work and interviewing people and collecting data, and you're sitting in a room and managing your clones.
They won't be interviewing people. People will be putting their avatars up to be interviewed by me.
Your avatar will be interviewing other people's avatars,
dystopia,
and you will be managing all of those interactions.
So speaking of sitting in a room with a bunch of robots, one of the other anxieties that we got a lot of questions about was about human interaction. When do I know that the person that I'm or the entity that I'm interacting with online is a human or a bot? Is this a cure for loneliness, or will it exacerbate it? What can we say to people when it is such an unknown? Ida?
Yeah, I guess, again, there are so many perspectives on this, but for me, there's always, there is some evidence right now that people, for example, going online and asking questions on social communities, for example, around, data, like I do a lot of data work, and people that will go in various online communities and ask questions of each other. They're not doing that anymore, and the interactions on those are just coming down because they're just asking the GPTs for those questions. And going back to this question of just from a work perspective, just going back to this question of how we're going to develop our skills if we are giving the challenging part of tasks to the AI, because you need to be challenged to learn. So if we are not doing that, and then the other part that we learn is the connection. We learn through our connections, and that's why mentorship at work is so important. And so this idea that at work or at home, we're just going to be interacting with technology, I think that growth and that personal growth is definitely going to be affected from my perspective. I think the loneliness probably, I would say just social isolation in general probably is going to be a lot more. I mean, at work, there's already research that is showing that people asking less questions of each other. And as I say, I think that has implications for this sort of personal growth and learning from each other and so on. And with the AI and interactions and AI, of course, AI knows a lot more knowledge and all of that, and we can definitely use it. We should, and I think we should even use it effectively. But I'm also worried about scenarios in which kids and young adults, because they're unhappy, they will sit to these chats and they develop reliance or a psychological dependency on these tools. And I mean, we all have heard about the scenario where there was a teenager who committed suicide, and the interactions just before that event, they had a lot of interactions with an LLM designed specifically for kids. So I can think about all of those scenarios where there's a lot of dependency, and also if these tools just sort of confirm and say, if you need validation, they just validate and tell you how good you are, and and suit you all the time. How do you really prepare for life? So there's a lot of, I think, questions, especially for parents, I think, and generations that are going to see these tools like really early on in their life.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think these are tools to counter social isolation. They're probably creating more problems than they're solving. And I think when we think about all of this type of stuff in mental health, I think it's very easy to say, well, there's a lot of what we have is, you're missing interaction. We can replace it with a robot or a chatbot or something like that. Maybe we can replace some care with these types of things. But I think when you talk about that care, machines don't care. They don't care about us. They can't care about us. So when you're talking about things that to do with care, that seems to only be the domain of people, and you can't do it. That doesn't mean that people in that industry can't say, here's a tool to help you. We've got this appointment now, you've got another appointment in 2 weeks. Here's a tool to help you in the meantime, remember what we said and figure out what you should be doing at each point. But I think we have to be really careful about moving into things like, care scenarios here. And I can see people's drive for efficiency to say, well, we can use the scarce resources we currently have to help. The worry is, of course, that you just start replacing those resources, and that's a big problem for social isolation in general.
Hassan?
I'm going to play a bit of a devil's advocate. So I think there is the need to have that aspect of guardrailing as much as you can. There are incidences that have happened after a discussion, having a chat with an AI. I'm sure similar things have happened after someone has talked to a human. They felt bad and bad things happen. But think about elderly people that are just feeling lonely. Now they can pay, whatever amount of dollars an hour for someone to listen to them just to feel better, or they can have it at a much more reasonable price to do it. They're not preparing for a future. They just want to feel better. If we're making them feel better, then yeah, pragmatically, why not? There was a survey on a paper, Tim, that asked people that they talked to a human versus an AI, which one had more empathy. And AI had more empathy. And you're telling it doesn't care. Well, it does demonstrate that it cares.
No, it doesn't.
And maybe
it deceives. It
sure,
fakes it, right?
but it makes the person feel better.
But they didn't know they were communicating with the robot, right? And I think they don't know they're communicating with the machine. And I think I agree with you. If it does make people feel better, great. I don't think it will, though. I think if you say here's a chatbot to interact with, it might help a little bit in the short term. But I don't think. Yeah, I think that the studies are out on that. And I think when you start saying this is a machine, you're talking about it, and it doesn't care. I think that it replicates empathy. I think that would wear off. I'm not sure. I'd like to be proven wrong, but I suspect. But I mean, I think you're right. It has to be tested.
Probably
hasn't it?
unethical to do those tests too much, though.
Yeah, it is.
So we have been receiving lots of questions from you who have been tuning into this discussion. You can continue to add your questions by hitting the Q&A button on the screen. But let's get into it. Andre says, will AI move from the internet to the physical world anytime soon? Who wants to pick that one up as I cough?
I can. At least I'll start a conversation. If I take that question correctly, there is this sort of that embodiment, of AI in terms of, robots. So that's like physical world. Yes, we can teach or integrate a lot of the natural language, for example, communication with the physical robots and so on. But I do want to talk specifically about a particular aspect of my research that I think we all are aware of it, but it's. I just want to sort of clarify it. One of the things that people talk about, when organizations use AI, is that AI helps improve processes. That's sort of what we all know, that process improvement, business process re-engineering, and all of the business opportunities that are there. But more and more, what we actually see is integration of AI with products. And imagine, like in the past, we had vacuum cleaner. Now we have smart vacuum cleaners. We had TV. We have a smart TV now. Every single product on earth that you can imagine, you can go and now put a natural language interface into it, create intelligent features that are, interacting with you. Some of for example, the example that I gave to you with the cochlear hearing aid, I would say that's a product that's wrapped with analytics or AI features because, and it's connected all the time. Or when people who drive, let's say Tesla cars, it brakes before you, And these intelligent features that are added to products, they're in our lives already. There are many, many, many examples of them in our lives, in our cars, TVs, speakers, and a lot in the productivity tools now that we use at work. So my answer to that is yes, we have the world of robots, but also there's this sort of these products, the services that we're really consuming. And the products that were physical ones, they've become digital and connected, and now they have an AI layer to them that starts either anticipating your needs or it will take action on your behalf, like the hearing aid or the Tesla car, or it will give you some insights, like the Johnson & Johnson, for example, has the glucose meters that will track your blood sugar levels and then give you visualizations and so on. So these smart products, physical smart products, they're all out there and we're already, I think, consuming them.
GCW is asking, good decisions in complex systems are made in part on data and in part on judgment. Are we at risk of making and accepting increasingly generic decisions by over-reliance or overconfidence in AI? Tim?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the way that I'll maybe direct the question to something that I think is interesting, which is around generic decisions. I mean, let's look at what we claim that things like large language models do with creativity, like allowing you to come up with ideas. And it's definitely true. I use it to come up with ideas. What studies show is that, say, if you take 10 people and you get them to all do a creative task using large language models, they come up with more original ideas than what they would otherwise. But if you take a control group of 10 people and get them to do it themselves, they come up with less ideas, but that group's ideas are much more diverse than the other ones, which kind of makes sense, right? Because they're all using the same tool to do tasks. So there is a risk that if we start deciding like, hey, we're going to make all of our decisions about what to do based on the same tool, that in the same industry, that everyone's just going to make similar decisions all the time. So there is that ability to say, well, okay, what I want to do is I want it to pull together all the data, but the judgment is mine. That's what I'd like to do. That will be slightly less generic, I think, if we do it that way.
Oh, sorry, Ida. One of you had something you wanted to add to that.
I'll go back to what Ida said, if that's okay. And when would AI get to our physical world? It already is, right? It's everywhere that you look at. But unlike humans, that we can't change our form, we always have to, have the same embodiment and do everything. it'll take a form that's best utilized for what it's doing. I think we'll just see more and more of moving away from large language models that just respond to your query to agents that actually act on your behalf. And to your point from before, if your task is just to monitor all the different robots that you've got, well, there's going to be one other robot that controls all of them, and then you don't need to do anything. So, taking that perspective.
A question from someone saying, how do you mitigate the environmental impact of AI? Is this something you've looked at, Ida?
I haven't, but I think it's a really, really important conversation. I have seen some people that they would say, oh, let's not use the GPT chat, for example, for this little topic because it is consuming energy. It is consuming huge amount of energy to run, build, maintain these models. So I think there's a really big question from a sustainability perspective of how much energy is put into the data centers, the running of the algorithms, the cooling of the infrastructure, and so on. And I don't think we have answers for it yet. And they're just growing and getting bigger and bigger. So it's something that is a really important question, and we need to look into it.
But I guess what we saw with DeepSeek is that you can
yeah.
have the same you can do the same thing with, so DeepSeek was the Chinese one. It's like comparable to ChatGPT. It's pretty good. But what the big thing was, they reportedly able to train it for around about $5 or $6 million, whereas training ChatGPT is about $100 million on a lot less computational power. Takes a lot less to run a query on it. There is that idea that most of computer science is about trying to do things more and more efficiently, that it might get more and more efficient, but nonetheless, it's still training it on things the size of the internet, so it's expensive. But I mean, I will comment that, and I don't want to be someone who's stepping in for large tech companies who are building data centers and using water to do it. The amount of energy is kind of scary, but it's not ridiculous, right? It's not up there with red meat. It's not up there with airline travel or anything like that. It's pretty bad. Like, we should be doing something about it, but it's not incredibly bad. What I would like to see is that we've got a group of companies that are all basically trying to do the same thing, is just maybe have one or two of them focus on building these large foundation models that everybody else can use, which would be a good start.
One I'll put to you, Hassan. Derek's asking, how can school and university students be supported in the use of AI for their learning?
It's a really good question. One we haven't figured out yet, to put it in short. Given that we think it is going to have a critical big impact in the future, I think it is a duty of care of universities to rethink how, at the same time, we give students the foundational knowledge that they need for their future, but also prepare them for a future where they work alongside AI. And the third piece of that puzzle, given how rapidly everything is changing, the best tool we can give students is the ability for them to learn themselves, metacognitive abilities, so that they have their own ability to regulate their own learning and learn new things easier and faster. So the combination of making sure that they still get all the foundational knowledge within their discipline, we're not sure whether these models are ever going to be accurate, so they're going to need that. Give them the ability, and many universities are moving to this two-lane model. Initially came out of the work of University of Sydney, Daniel Liu and colleagues. We give some tasks to students, which is just their own work, especially for assessment. This is going to be no AI. You're just going to be on yourself. We want to see if you have the competencies to do this well. This is critical. And we also have a second lane, which is all about how to use AI to complete tasks. How do we allow you? How do we give you the tools that you need and then teach you how to use them effectively? AI literacy used to mean just knowing how to use AI and what's an effective way to use it. I'm happy to see now we're looking a lot more into critical AI literacy, which goes beyond just how AI works and has that societal impact and duty of care and the ethics lens to also say, you're using it, this is what you're getting, but this is going to be the impact on society, and this is various biases that you're taking. How are you going to take that into consideration in how you're working with it?
And one question from Malcolm, whoever wants to jump on this one first can. Who's ultimately responsible and accountable when AI causes harm?
It's easy.
The individual.
It's not a hard question. It's exactly the same as any other piece of software or any other device you do.
Yeah.
I thought this was like a thorny ethical question to wind us up.
No, it's simple. There's nothing special about AI. It's a piece of software. The difference is that people use it you can use it to give judgments, take actions, these types of things like you can with software, but it doesn't change the accountability. I guess the interesting part of that whole question which is to do with technology and accountability more general. And if I could give one piece of reading, it's by a person called Madeline Eilish. She wrote a paper called The Moral Crumple Zone. It's that what we tend to do is just blame the person who was sitting next to it at the time, right? So she has situations where there was nuclear meltdown. The people who were blamed were the people in the control room, but all the technology was sending them incorrect information to the point where they did exactly what they were supposed to do, but they were still blamed for it. And so that's where I think accountability becomes a bit more murky when you're talking about machine learning. We're starting to take judgments. You make a judgment. It was the wrong call. The tool said you to make it, but you should have caught it, Tegan, because you're the expert.
giant brain.
Yeah, that's right. So you should have caught it. That's where it becomes a bit murky, not so much legally who's accountable, but who do organizations really hold to account? And the history suggests they just hold account the person who was using it sitting near it. But really, it's very clear legally who's accountable.
Tim, in the context of self-driving cars, and that's been a bit of a debate, right? Would it sit with the creator of the car or the driver?
Right, it's the driver of the car.
The driver has purchased this thing that has
correct.
been advertised as you don't need to do anything.
No, it's not. I mean, Elon Musk advertises it like that, but it's very clear. When something happens, Elon Musk says, no, you've got to monitor, you're the driver, right? Okay. And so tech companies are certainly not putting their hand out to take responsibility for problems when tech goes wrong. They're quite happy to say, oh, it's the user's responsibility. But it's always the same, whether it's a piece of software, a digital device, AI.
I think the difference, I agree with you that it's a piece of software, but I think the difference that is there is that a lot of the pieces of technology, software, were deterministic and AI is not. And I agree with you that it's clear that where accountability
where
sits.
It currently stands, yeah.
Where it currently stands. First of all, there is no point in attributing accountability to the machine.
No.
Because you can't put it in jail. You can. What are you going to do with it?
There's
just either it's the user or it's the company. The problem I think that we have right now is that we actually don't understand the risks. For example, Tesla car, someone is driving it, of course we're going to be distracted, and of course we're going to be, all of these things we talk about automation complacency. Over time, we're going to basically get, okay, first, we're very engaged, we're validating every single decision, and then we're comfortable, and then we're reading a newspaper, listening to a thing, and then something goes wrong. So we just don't understand. I mean, everyone talks about the governance and oversight of it, but then the scale is so big, governance becomes a framework on the shelf. And in that moment, what happens to the oversight? We don't know. Like, from my perspective, from one side, we need to use technology against technology, because humans are going to be either, asleep or, it's going to be very boring to a car that drives itself. You're not going to be super engaged after 5 hours. There's going to be, you're going to be distracted. And a lot of the features that you can implement rules and features into the technology that tries to sort of, bring the human back in, either, by, nudging them or, doing something. And I don't have the solution for it. I think we don't have the solution. I think we just don't understand. For the software, it was really easy to say, what are the risks? Not really easy, but much easier. Where are the risks and how do we cover the accountability side? But with AI, it's just, we don't know how, when, what's gonna happen. And I think one of the things that I also wanted to add was basically on the risk side, I think this notion of resilience. And at the end of the day, we need resilient organizations and resilient societies. And this resilience, by it, I mean that there's going to be something unexpected happening. There's going to be somewhere that the machine is going to make the wrong decision and do the right thing. And these incidents are going to be bigger and bigger. Do we have a plan for it? And a resilient organization would be an organization that has done scenario planning, has understood the risks upfront as much as possible. But where we stand with this technology is that there's a lot of unknown in terms of the risks and so on. So are we resilient enough to let them, take over? Just no.
So much promise and so many pitfalls, but good thing we have experts like this keeping us on the straight and narrow. We do need to leave it there. We are out of time. Thank you so much to Tim, Ida and Hassan for joining us in the studio, for sharing your expertise. And thank you for joining us from wherever you're tuning in around the world. It's always such a pleasure having our alumni and wider UQ community join us online for this series. We look forward to igniting your curiosity more throughout the year with other UQ Talks, both online and in person. So keep an eye on your inbox, not you, Tim. Everyone else, keep an eye on your emails for more UQ Talks invitations. Until then, good night.